right, so a few things I want to mention off the top. So on Canvas, that third homework, I realized I selected the wrong day. However, because I incorrectly selected it, I'll leave the due date the same. But I just want to point out that due date is actually a Wednesday. So I meant to set it for a Tuesday, so it kind of lines up with our class. It's a day off, just, kind of looks a little bit different. Some of the other homeworks where it's due on a day where we're not meeting. So I wanted to make sure, that date is fine. I'll leave it at that, but just so if you're scheduling, you don't think that it's like Thursday, because it's kind of in between the class periods there. Also, I should have every single person kind of have sent data to them, with the exception of a couple people that I was waiting on an email from a comment on Canvas or something like that. There's still a couple of you out there. So if you haven't gotten it from me, either something got lost in an email kind of slipped through the cracks, you should kind of have a response and data sent from me at this point. So if not, please contact me via email, and we can kind of get that squared away. Have all day tomorrow to kind of get those last minute, if anyone didn't realize, I didn't see that comment. So please email me as soon as possible. I'd like to try to make sure everyone has something by the end of the day tomorrow. And then I mentioned that homework assignment. Any other questions from me at this point? Okay, so we'll kind of pick up where we left off. We've been talking about the labor market. We looked at discrimination. We then started thinking about, what about if we, transition from the current setting to allowing kind of a free and open labor market at the NCAA level, right, at the collegiate level. So we've got a couple of additional things that we didn't talk about last week, or that use what we talked about last Thursday and kind of build upon it. So if students did become employees, right, we might have some additional issues as well, right? So potentially there's some labor laws that, a certain number of hours that student athlete could work that would kind of come into play, right? So if we're going to limit supply there of the amount of labor that any one given player can supply, that's going to start to have impacts, right? If your supply decrease, we kind of predict what would happen to wages and the quantity of players. We also can think about, the cooperation between the collegiate level and then kind of the NBA or the NFL. So, they set these minimum age requirements, or they have in the past, that you have to have a certain number of years removed from high school to be able to kind of enter these professional leagues. If we eliminated this and we now allow the NCAA to be able to pay players, then potentially I see kind of a decrease in supply, right? Because if there's now kind of almost another professional league, that's what the NCAA would become. If these minimum age requirements were eliminated, right, then, some of our student athletes who may have went to college prior to going to the professional level are now going to go directly to the professional level. So what's going to happen? We're going to see a kind of a labor supply decrease potentially. Okay? Specifically, when we're looking, if we were to break this down by kind of the quality of players, maybe at the higher end, we see kind of this huge reduction, right, in the supply of high quality kind of athletes. And, maybe that doesn't occur all the way down to kind of low quality players, but at least at the top, we would expect we see kind of a pretty large reduction in supply if we were to eliminate some of these rules, which the only reason why they are, I guess, legal now is because, it's not between two professional leagues that they're setting these minimum age requirements, because it's kind of student athletes, right? Which if we start paying them, they kind of would be treated a little bit differently. Okay? So we're starting to think about maybe there's some shifts in supply that could occur. So we're starting to think about the supply curve component. We'll kind of dive into this in a little more here in a second. But if we see supply decreases, we've looked at a lot of models like this, and it'd be pretty straightforward that we would see a supply decrease, which would push the price or wages up, and then kind of decrease the number of players we would expect to see in the collegiate level. The NCAA also restricts roster size, so it has like the number of possible scholarships currently, and it sets that. So you can only have a roster that's so big. If we start paying players, having this roster limit, if we eliminated that as well, what we might see is kind of an increase in labor supply. Right? And I say labor supply, I should be a little bit more exact here. So we wouldn't necessarily see an increase in labor supply, but we might see an increase in the quantity supplied. So the dot cam, there we go. And I don't know if this helps or not. We'll see if this helps. I don't think the light helps. So let's think about a labor market. This one works a little bit better. So we've got our quantity of labor, our wage. Right? So maybe currently the supply of labor looks something like this, and the demand for labor looks something like this. So the equilibrium quantity would be somewhere out here, but with a roster limit, we kind of said this for the professional leagues, it looks similar to this, right? So this is kind of our roster limit, right? So if we were to eliminate this, instead of being before stuck at Q1, right? Let's say we just eliminate it completely, we can see this increase in the equilibrium quantity of workers, or the number of players, or the hours supplied. Well, sorry, this isn't hours supplied because we're specifically looking at the roster limit. So an increase in the number of players, we would expect to see an increase in the number of players if this roster limit was kind of removed, right? So we're going from a situation where there was a limit to where there is no limit. Okay? Actually, we've kind of talked about this a little bit in relationship to the professional leagues, but we could see it at the collegiate level as well. Any questions on this before I keep moving here? This is pretty simple. I just want to kind of draw that out. All right, so keep going here. All right, this is the one I wanted to kind of make sure we focus on a lot. So we think about the number of games that would be kind of supplied. Well, we could even think about not just the number of games, but we think about kind of the quality, right, or the number of targeted wins for these teams. So if we were now negotiating with players for wages and they weren't just given kind of a scholarship, then, excuse me, if we wanted to play kind of a higher number of games, right, so let's say wages are negotiable. If college then starts to play a higher number of games, then players would require higher pay. Right? You can kind of think about it as, if I want to play more games, I'm going to have the quantity of labor increase, right? Kind of per player, the quantity of labor would have to increase, right? They're playing a higher number of games, okay? So that's going to increase costs, right? Or can increase the cost to the player, which means that they wouldn't be willing to supply their labor for as low of a wage as before, right? You can kind of think about this as the marginal cost to kind of supply my labor now is higher because I have to play a higher number of games, okay? So one thing that we could think about also is how this relates to kind of the win market, right? So my marginal costs, right, if I was thinking about for these colleges, it's a little bit different than what we were looking at before. So I'll keep marginal cost constant just to simplify it. Let me see if there we go. This marker's a little bit better. So we've got this, oh, sorry. I'm in the mindset of the labor market here. If we were instead looking at the kind of targeted number of wins, right? With professional teams, we were thinking about we have this constant kind of marginal cost, right? So there's some demand curve, and even if they were able to kind of have monopoly power and we have a marginal revenue curve, what's kind of weird about colleges currently, I mean, we talked about the value of a scholarship to these large programs are usually zero, because if it's not displacing another student and that student would have went there regardless of whether or not you gave them the scholarship, then the cost was really zero, right? So you can almost think about before the targeted number of wins for these college teams, and we said each number of wins really could be, we could translate into that how much money would have to be spent to get that target number of wins. The marginal cost in terms of at least salary were zero, right? Now, there were other costs, so it wasn't that it was necessarily running along the x-axis, but for college sports, you can think about the marginal cost of a win here was relatively low because we don't have this huge cost, which is salaries, right? If I want to win more games, increase my quality, I'm going to have to increase the amount of money I'm spending on salaries, right? Which will then increase the quality of player I have and increase my targeted wins. So let's say this was the scenario before where we'll call this kind of W1, right? This is the optimal, we can even call W star 1, right? The optimal number of wins kind of prior to paying players. If we now allow players to be paid, that's going to raise my marginal cost per win dramatically, right? So I might see something like this, right, where I see an increase. We'll call this marginal cost 2, not squared, but 2. Okay. So we could kind of see a lot of teams are going to be targeting a lower number of wins, right? And, you know, if this decreases the quality of some programs enough, we're going to end up with this kind of, and who will decrease the quality of the most? The teams that face the lowest demand curves. Because if my demand curve is still way out here, I'm still going to be targeting a high number of wins, right? Now, what could occur is for some programs, if we had marginal cost raised high enough, well, there's no point. There's no number of games. Even if I have a team and they win 0 games, I'm going to be having negative profits, right? The additional revenue generated from that very first game is less than the additional costs, right? So some of these programs, if salaries raise marginal cost enough, are just going to cease to exist, right? Shutting down, having a profit of 0 is better than having negative profits. Now, what types of programs? So if we think about this in terms of a single sport, so let's say we just look at football, the types of programs we can expect this to occur is going to be those at the bottom, right? Those facing the lowest demand curve. So probably our smaller conferences or D3, D2 programs. If I want to think about this in terms of which sports could this occur the most for, well, if the athletic department doesn't operate as a whole now, and each sport kind of has to operate independently, the teams that face the lowest demand curve would be your kind of lower interest sports, right? So sports that probably don't have professional leagues. We don't think there's as much kind of interest in them across the population. And so if we have costs that would get high enough, potentially we could drive out not just those kind of lower quality men's basketball programs, but potentially push out a lot of the kind of minor sports, right? The sports that don't have as high of a following or as high of a demand curve. Okay. Any questions over this? So we're just using an old model that we've thought about and thinking about what now paying players is going to do to marginal costs, right? It's going to increase them quite a bit. All right. So marginal cost of each one is going to be quite a bit higher, right? So we look at the current number of teams, right? It's about 250 in football and 350 in basketball. Potentially some of those get driven out of the market, right? So it would allow teams to enter more freely, but it would also allow them to exit more freely, right? If it's raising costs quite a bit, we could see some teams drop out. But also currently the NCAA is limiting the number of programs. So maybe there's some profitable programs out there. Now, if the NCAA is doing their job correctly, they probably accept what they believe is to be the most likely, like highest profitable programs first. But there could still be some out there right now that they haven't let in, right? And so maybe we'd see some universities actually start some more programs, okay? If this happened, we could think about this is going to drive the supply curve, right, in terms of this number of games up. Okay? If the supply curve for the number of games increases, right, we would expect that we would see a higher number of games played, right? And so how is this going to work? So this potentially is causing teams to exit, but maybe there's some teams currently that aren't being allowed in the NCAA that have a high enough demand curve that they would enter. Okay? If teams entered after we kind of open up this labor market and, you know, don't allow kind of this cartel behavior of the NCAA to determine, you know, how many teams are there. We just think the total number of games being played at the NCAA level, right? Maybe we focus just on one sport. you think about before we had kind of our supply curve, we had our demand curve, right? So this is like demand overall for NCAA. We could look at football or basketball games. Here is our supply curve. These represented kind of every time we play more games, it's either we have to have the same number of teams play those games, or if we have a fixed number of games in a season, we have to start adding more teams. So if this free and open kind of market where the NCAA can't keep teams out occurs, we would start to see potentially more teams added. So a supply kind of increase, right, at the same price per game. We would see this supply increase, right, which would predict kind of our number of games we would increase. And it's kind of intuitive. That's a pretty intuitive result, right? But, you know, just relating things to other markets that we've already looked at, right? So that's pretty easy, if there's anything too tough there. So what would potentially the impact of these higher wages be? So if we start to allow these schools to pay players, what's it, you know, we may have variation in how it impacts different student athletes. So if we have a free and open labor market, yeah, wages are going to increase for some because currently wages are, you know, essentially the value of a tuition at best, right? Well, so who's going to value the most? Well, this kind of relates to what we talked about last class. I kind of built this in a little bit, but we said whatever sports have the highest marginal revenue per win, that was who was going to benefit the most. But there's a second part of that demand curve, right? We said the demand curve for labor, I kind of have this written down so when we switch over to the slides, represents the value of the marginal number of additional wins that player brings in, which is just the marginal revenue per win times the number of additional wins that player brings in. So when you think about higher quality players, we were saying they would bring in a higher number of additional wins, which would drive up that demand curve and predict that those high quality players are paid a higher amount of money. Okay? Not only that, really, if you want to, you know, we could combine this in two ways, right? High quality players are most likely are going to have the highest value, right, when the marginal revenue per win is also high. So your high quality players are more likely to go to these high revenue generating programs. So the demand for their labor is going to be really, really high. And we would expect pretty high wages for those high quality players. Right? So we've got kind of both components would be impacted for these high quality players. They'd be more likely to end up on the teams that have the highest marginal revenue per win. They have the highest marginal number of wins that's coming from their labor. And so we would expect star players to have these really high wages. Right? So if we didn't just have to pay every football on the player the exact same amount, we could kind of allow that to vary. We would expect a huge increase in wages for those at the top. Why do we expect a huge increase in wages? Well, we can actually think about currently, if we were just to draw out the labor market for those kind of top tier high quality players. So maybe even if we wanted to look at just one player, right? So they're going to have some supply curve, amount of labor that they would supply, and then there's going to be a demand for that labor, which is going to follow kind of the equation we have up here. So before, what was happening was, and you know, we could, you know, you kind of could go look at this two different ways. You could look at one way, which is that, you know, the value of the tuition maybe was down here, right? So I don't know. Let's say this was, I don't know, $20,000 a year. So we'll put this at, maybe the value of the tuition was $80,000. So we were kind of, you can almost think about this as like, almost like having set a minimum wage, right? Because I can't pay the player more than that. Right? However, so I was kind of limited to kind of the supply that I was seeing from these players. We'll kind of call this Q1 star. Okay. However, after I remove this minimum wage, it's not just the value of the tuition. I can now pay the player whatever I want. And as long as it's kind of a free and open labor market, I know I should get up to the point where supply is equal to demand. Okay. So we think about after the change, right, we're going to see the amount of labor supplied by that player increases. So the best way, yeah. So this would be, think about this as a price ceiling, right? I said this backwards. I think I said, I'm just calling this a minimum wage. This is not a minimum wage. This is a maximum wage. So right, I can't pay a player more than the value of the scholarship in the old scenario. Now I can. So I kind of can see, call this W2. And before, right, my wage is down here. The best way to think about this is, I think the wage increase is pretty intuitive. Like once we remove that kind of maximum I can pay a player, I'll see wages go up because they, currently they're being paid an amount that was well below their value to the team, right? Well below that demand curve. The quantity increase is a little bit trickier to think about. Like how can this player supply a higher amount of labor? Well, I think the best way to think about this is, we said when we're looking at just one individual player, this is units of labor. We could break up units of labor in terms of like quality units of labor. So maybe this is a player who superstar in the league, right? If you're only going to give him this much, he maybe doesn't practice as hard, or he or she doesn't practice as hard. Potentially, because of the risk of injury, if you're not paying that player, and there's potential future opportunities for them, maybe they don't play as many games, or they sit out a few more minutes per game. So you're really thinking about here is you're getting kind of a difference in that quality of labor units. Okay. So we could even see kind of a higher production level at the collegiate level if we kind of remove this maximum, right? This price ceiling. Excuse me. Any questions on that? Excuse me. Now, let's see if I don't want to complicate too much on this graph. So I think I think we can do this all in one. So what's going to happen if instead of looking at high quality players, I'm looking at lower quality players? So for lower quality players, and we'll even say, let's just assume for a second they're on the same team. So if it's a lower quality player, my marginal wins coming from that labor will be lower. Right? So we'll just right in here, we could think about this was for the demand curve for high quality players. So what would the demand curve for low quality players look like? Well, it's going to be lower, right? This marginal wins coming from that labor is going to be lower. Potentially, we could even have something like this. So here's our demand curve from low quality players, where possibly before actually giving them the scholarship was actually more money than what their equilibrium wage would have been. Right? So if I now allow, I'll kind of draw out here, we'll call this the wage for low quality players. I can see here that for high quality players, wages would go up, right? After we allow these teams to play players. But for low quality players, potentially, their equilibrium wage would be below whatever that tuition remission or that scholarship was worth to them. So if I'm a low quality player and I look at this, if instead of scholarships, colleges are paying the athletes, that might actually be a worse scenario for me, right? Good scenario for the high quality player, not good for the low quality player. Now, if I could use a combination, if I'm the university, what type of players am I going to want to start giving scholarships to? High or low quality? If I go to a high quality player and say, I'll give you this $80,000 scholarship instead of paying you, what's that high quality player going to say? Yeah, if this is a free and open labor market, I'm going to find another team who will pay me the value that I would bring in. I can go get higher wages somewhere else. For the low quality player, if instead of offering them this wage, you just say, well, instead of paying you, I'll give you a kind of a free ride scholarship, right? Tuition remission. Well, if the value of that tuition remission is greater than the wage that I would have otherwise paid them, they'd be happier taking that tuition remission as opposed to just being paid a wage. Right? So if we could allow colleges to have a combination of the two, it'd be more likely we see that these low quality players are given scholarships where the high quality players are simply kind of paid with these higher wages. And maybe, maybe I pay them a wage and along with a scholarship or something, but for sure it's going to be more advantageous to offer those scholarships to your lower quality players, because you know that the tuition remission is going to be worth more to them than the equilibrium wage you would have otherwise paid them. Any questions on that? Because I know I kind of threw a couple, kind of mashed two graphs together here. Two different concepts, I should say. Oh, just in case you couldn't read this down here, that was a wage of the low quality player. All right. Okay. So we kind of already went through that, the impacts that we would see on lower quality players and also smaller programs, right? So I just gave you an example where it was working through the quality of the player. We could also expect a similar thing. If I'm looking at smaller programs, their marginal revenue per win is lower, so their demand curve is lower. So instead of low, high quality players, we could think about here, this would represent the wage of also smaller programs, so that smaller programs would be more willing to, or more likely to be offering these tuition remissions or these scholarships as opposed to paying players. Well, as kind of your larger programs, right, instead of thinking about quality, if we thought about a larger program, higher quality program, their marginal revenue per win would be higher, and they'd be more likely to pay kind of these wages than give scholarships. Okay. Any questions on this? You know, one of the other huge impacts here is going to be, I mean, if we allow a free and open labor market, what teams could pay high quality players the most? It's going to be the teams that have the highest marginal revenue per win, your larger, already kind of high quality programs. So they're going to get better. Who's not getting quality athletes? Maybe your lower quality, right? Because right now, if we want to think about it this way, and there are obviously a lot of factors we could enter into this equation. So I'm going to simplify it, and I understand it's not the most realistic kind of way to think about it, but it boils it down to kind of the root kind of difference between the two programs. So if I have a high and low quality program, maybe we think about this as like, what's a good example in Indiana? Maybe we'll look at IU, and we could probably even think about the difference between IU and Ball State. Right? Currently, if I'm an athlete, or I'm thinking about maybe playing basketball, and I look at those two programs, if I'm going to get a free ride at either one, I'm getting, you know, the value of that, and let's say, you know, I'm biased, but, you know, Kelly's great, but I got our business school's pretty damn good too. So let's say I could have the same employment opportunities kind of after I leave. So kind of value of the degree is similar there. You know, presently, the wage I would be getting paid as a student athlete was really kind of just that degree, right? Whatever that tuition remission would be. However, if I allow teams to pay each other, right, IU has a much higher revenue per win than Ball State, right? And so they could offer to pay that player a much higher amount. Well, currently they can't. Currently, all they can do is offer the same kind of tuition remission, right? So we go from a scenario where these players are going to have kind of otherwise, you know, similar value on going to either place. Whereas if I allow these teams to start paying players, the wages are going to be much higher at these programs like IU because their marginal revenue per win is so much higher. That's just going to be another thing that kind of helps to kind of make competitive balance worse. Okay. So we see competitive balance get quite a bit worse. Now you could make an argument here that, well, we've talked about already, well, if costs go up, some of these low quality teams drop out of the league, which kind of gets rid of your low quality programs, making competitive balance a little bit better. So we kind of have competing effects here. But, you know, how many teams would have to leave to compensate for what we know is going to occur, which is the higher quality players are going to be able to be paid more at the high quality or larger programs, and really, really kind of force this competitive balance gap to get even wider. Okay. Any questions at this point before we kind of keep going here? All right. And we've already mentioned this, right? So this is that small programs might not be able to exist. So what are some hypothetical changes that we could expect to see as well? So if we look at the highest revenue schools, or said differently, you could also think about this as the highest revenue generating sports. They're probably going to operate pretty similar to what we see in the professional levels. Right? So they're profit maximizing. They're paying players, subject to the free and open labor market. While our lowest revenue generating schools, we already kind of pointed out, they're going to be the ones that are more likely to offer college scholarships. In order to compete, potentially they're win maximizing, so they may not hold on to not going to hold on to any profits. They're just going to spend until they can kind of get to this profit level of zero. And we kind of already have discussed those impacts as well in the last graph that we looked at. So I think I've got some demand concerns and then some supply concerns that we're going to go through. So the demand concerns we might think about is, all right, so the NCAA decides we're going to let schools now pay players, right? Potentially, the consumers of college sports value things that are different from the consumers of professional sports. So if there's any type of utility from the consumers of the sport, so this is like people, paying to attend the game, people paying for the cable package to watch the games, if they think that, have any utility that's derived from this being kind of an amateur level, right? That there's something about players that are playing and there's no wages, associated with it. They're not getting really paid to play. Maybe that's part of the utility of the consumers. Well, if I now start paying players, that goes away. Well, now my consumers, the demand curve decreases for all of my products, right? Decreases for my ticket in the ticket market, decreases in the apparel market. That would decrease kind of the demand curve we see in the broadcast market. So potentially, if I eliminate kind of this thing that consumers care about, we'll see this demand curve decrease, okay? Which would just predict that we see lower revenue overall for college programs. We also might think about maybe there's a difference in how much consumers enjoy competitive balance at the collegiate level versus the professional level. So we know overall, like there's a lot of studies out there, and we even talked about a couple of them, that consumers do value competitive balance, right? Not knowing the outcome of an event. However, maybe in college sports, the consumers, right, are really only consumers because of one university, and they want to see that when, they don't necessarily want to see the fairest kind of bouts or the fairest kind of matchups all the time. They really want to see their team win. And yeah, they do care about competitive balance, but only to an extent, right? So maybe that is a little bit going to vary from the college to the professional level, in which case any of these things that we were talking about that would change competitive balance would then greatly impact the demand curve for that sport overall. Right? So these are some hypothetical things that we kind of can think about. Yeah, right. They may not care as much, right? We could lead to kind of these decreases in the demand curve if we start paying players. And I already kind of mentioned this one was kind of in the first bullet point, but the idea that, because we're not paying players, right, that there was some utility consumers got for that, and they were willing to pay more for tickets, more for apparel, whereas now when we pay them, we see decreases in the demand curve for all those things. Okay. Questions on this? It's kind of more of a summary of kind of a lot of the things we've talked about. So one thing that, and I think the original version of the slides I posted didn't have this. I'll get this updated after class today. I had to add some animations in and things that would show that things would show up at different points in time. So supply differences is just kind of a blank slide. And I want to start to think about maybe what could cause supply differences, but also the impacts of that. Okay. So let's say we start out in this scenario. We've got the quantity of labor, we got wages up here. Okay. So I'm going to try to choose two pretty similar programs. Let's do, I don't know what the comparison would be. So let's do, let's think about the demand curve that comes from Harvard and the demand curve that comes from another school out east that'd be like a comparable kind of size and quality in their sports programs. Let's think about, I don't know, like you guys might not, well, I want to use an example that you guys would know of. Harvard and let's do, I forget what it's called, long, I should have thought about this example so I didn't have to do this on the fly. I don't do Harvard, let's do, well, I think I use this. I don't want to use the example I used in the homework. That's the one. That's the one thing that's kind of stuffing me here. So let's do Harvard and I don't know. We'll choose University of Delaware. Right. We look at probably. I'm trying to think about two schools that would have similar quality kind of sports programs, but there is a main difference. So the demand curve that's coming from both of them. Let's assume for a second the marginal revenue per win is similar between the University of Delaware and Harvard. Let's assume that that's the case. I think about supply differences though. So maybe I've got this supply curve for Delaware, and it would predict equilibrium wages would be somewhere up here. So let's call it WD for Delaware. What do you think if I was looking at the same wage, right? So let's say I'm thinking about the same wage here. What do you think is probably true about the supply of labor to Harvard versus Delaware? Right? Lower. So you think it's why would you think it's lower?
Because it's harder to get into.
So okay, it's harder to get into. So all right, you could be right. So right, there's potentially two things, right? So possibly the academic quality of the player wouldn't allow them to get into Harvard. Right? Let's assume that we're looking at just one player. So you're right. If we're thinking about kind of the quantity of players as our units of labor, we might see a lower supply curve for Harvard because there's just a fewer number of students who can even meet the academic requirement. That's you're thinking about this good. Let's say now we look at one player. So now we're holding constant all the attributes about the player. So they have a high enough quality, they could get into Delaware or into Harvard. Let's assume they have the academic standards that meet both. If I'm thinking about making a choice between Delaware and Harvard, why might, unless we're assuming that they have kind of the same quality of team, why might I want to choose Harvard over Delaware? Why would you want to choose Harvard over Delaware given the opportunity? So it's Harvard, and then you know that there are tons of employment opportunities, and I try to choose two programs that your likelihood of going to the professional level is relatively low, right? So why might I choose Harvard? Well, because there's this additional benefit. I'll have a Harvard degree when I'm done playing. Now, a Delaware degree is not bad, but a Harvard degree is much better, right? So you could actually pay me less, right, from Harvard, and I'd be willing to supply the same amount of labor. Think about that said differently. If I think about the same quantity of labor here, I'm saying at Harvard, because there's this additional benefit, you'd be willing to take less. And that'd be true at every quantity of labor. So you actually would see, I'm sorry, my marker's running out here. I'm going to grab some new ones before next class. You could actually think about this as the supply curve for Harvard, right, from that one player, right, it would be higher, right, or it would be kind of increased. Right? And the wage, equilibrium wage that Harvard could get away paying is going to be a little bit lower, right? And that's, that kind of seems intuitive, right? If we could hold constant all these other factors, maybe I did a bad job choosing Delaware, but two otherwise kind of equal quality programs, right? Their marginal revenue per win is similar, and we're looking at the same quality of player, we would expect that player would take a lower wage to play for Harvard than they would at Delaware, right? And the idea there really comes from, so the additional benefit of Harvard, remember, supply curves represent marginal costs, okay? So if I'm thinking about marginal cost, the opportunity cost of going to Delaware is whatever the value of that degree is that I'm missing out on from Harvard, right? So it's essentially like your lower academic institutions, the opportunity cost of going there is higher, and so you'd end up with this kind of decrease in the supply curve. Think about this, let's say I could go play, I don't know, let's say every university had a program just to really make this point. if I could go play and then get a degree from, I don't know, who am I going to pick on today? What's a good party school? Well, I don't know. I'll pick on a school in Indiana. So let's say I could go to, IPFW, right? Indiana, Purdue, Fort Wayne, right? And I could play there, or I could go to kind of Notre Dame University, right? Well, the value of that Notre Dame degree is so much higher that if I go play at Indiana, Purdue, Fort Wayne, that's my opportunity cost, right? So my marginal cost of going there would be significantly higher. Right? And this would be kind of the idea between kind of this Delaware and Harvard here. Any questions on this? So I phrase this in a way in which it's, I set this example up thinking about the value of the degree at these different universities. But possibly their value of other things is different between the universities as well. So I don't have to just think about what could cause supply differences in terms of the academic quality of the institution. The other example I had been thinking about is what would, if there was anybody who wanted to pursue a career in the military, right? But also wanted to have a college, student athlete experience at college. So maybe instead of Harvard here, I'm thinking about this as like Army, I want to go attend West Point, right? Well, I can play for the Army football team and also get that, come out of the kind of my 4-year degree and go right into my military career, right? But if I go to another school, like, I don't know, choose another one out there, West Virginia, right? Somewhere out kind of the East Coast. Well, what I'm foregoing is kind of having that West Point kind of experience on my, what am I thinking? So that West Point experience, but also kind of having it on my resume or kind of thinking about, I'm now ready to go in and become an officer at the, in the U.S. Army. I can't get that potentially if I go to a school like West Virginia. And so if I go to West Virginia, which would replace Delaware here, you'd have to pay me a higher wage because I'm foregoing this additional benefit from going to West Point. Okay? So it doesn't just have to be the academic quality. It could be anything else that matters to that player or that player values. Right? This could be as dumb. Actually, this isn't dumb. This happens for sure. And it doesn't happen in wages because players aren't currently paid. But if we are fixing the wage, right, we can think about, well, the place I'm going to choose is just the place that I kind of have the greatest benefit of attending. And so another thing that could kind of change supply differences here are something as simple as, well, it's close to home, right? Or my parents were alumni, right? And so that could be another thing that kind of increases the supply curve there as well. Okay. Questions? Any other questions on that? Make sure I don't have anything in the chat. Okay. We're out in time. All right. Okay, so that was kind of our supply differences, right? And there's a lot, like I said, there's a myriad of different examples we could use, and we're really just thinking about the value of attending these different universities is different, and that's going to kind of shift that supply curve. The value to the player, I should say. Excuse me. So some other things that we might have some current concerns about would be like Title IX concerns. So, currently excess profits made in sports, subsidize some of the other sports in the school. So this is the idea that, college football, generally, a lot of the revenue generated by them helps to kind of let the other sports that don't generate as much revenue break even, like, I don't know, golf and kind of these other lower revenue generating sports at colleges. So one exception, if we think about women's basketball, there are likely some programs that have a pretty good following, pretty high marginal revenue per win, and actually are profitable, right? But for the most part, we're thinking about the main two profit generators at the majority of schools are going to be men's football and basketball, okay? Well, the problem is if we have these kind of Title IX, one of the things is we have to have an equal number of kind of teams in. Well, right away, you've already got two that the university isn't going to eliminate because they're the highest revenue generating programs and they're both male sports, right? So, as we started to see these labor costs increase, well, now it's going to be, you know, if the costs go up high enough, we're going to have to start seeing what programs are going to go first, or what types of sports are going to start to go first. Well, the ones that have the lowest marginal revenue per win. If there's any discrepancy across kind of male and female sports, and we start to see maybe, you know, female sports drop initially, but we'd have to kind of compensate that to kind of make sure we have the same number of sports offered for both males and females. So we potentially have some Title IX concerns here if we allow this to be just completely free and open labor market. And, you know, if we open that up, potentially it kind of hurts female sports. We know that, you know, we look at revenue differences across male and female sports. Generally, there's some exceptions, and we kind of discussed a few of them, where we generally see lower revenues from the female or women's sports. And so if they're now required to pay their players kind of this higher wage and increase the cost, maybe we see some of those drop out, and this could actually kind of hinder kind of the opportunities for females at the collegiate level as well by creating this free and open labor market. Okay. And I threw this slide in here, you know, things like the Affordable Care Act or anything that kind of requires health insurance is also going to greatly increase kind of your costs here, because once you start paying these players, they may expect kind of, you know, if you're a company, right, and you have more than 50 employees, you have to provide health insurance. Well, this is going to be pretty bad for athletic departments, right? Especially if we don't treat individual teams differently. It's just the athletic department. Because wages don't capture everything. We've talked about this a little bit before. We talk about things in terms of our models that we're drawing out as wages, but we could very easily think about this as just the value of wages plus benefits, right? So these would be some other additional concerns we might have. Okay. All right. So I'm going to transition a little bit here, kind of end class out with a slightly different topic. So, you know, what do students benefit the most, or what types of students will benefit most from being a college athlete? Who benefits most from having the degree? Well, majors that have high expected incomes, right, or starting salaries. So obviously the players that probably, you would think that who does it benefit the most? Well, your high quality players. Well, that's only if we pay them wages. We're going back to this current scenario where all I can do is offer scholarships. Right? So if I'm thinking about the general student athlete, not kind of these top quality who then make it to the professional level, the average student athlete in any sport, right, the real value is the degree. Right? You could argue that the top programs in men's basketball and football, this isn't true, but for the vast majority of student athletes across the country, the real value of being a student athlete there, what you're going to leave with after you get done, is this college degree, right? And the value of that degree depends on not only where you get it, but also the kind of the major you choose. Right? So, you know, not to go too much into this, but even if even if you go and you say, you know, you look at me and you say, well, look, you know, I know some of these, you look at some of these athletes, these student athletes, you know, maybe they're not taking advantage of every single opportunity that these institutions have to offer in terms of academics. So they may leave and really not have gained as much as maybe some of the other students. Well, that's fine, even if you want to come in thinking about it that way, because degrees are often usually, you know, they do signal, right, that not only your intellectual ability or the skills that you have, but they also just signal other things to future employees, which is future employers, which is just that you can accomplish what you need to accomplish to get a college degree, right? You can jump through, you know, when I went, I had some classes where you're just jumping through the hoops, or you're writing what you know that professor wants to hear, or maybe you just barely get through on the skin of your teeth and you're just getting C's in every class, but you get the degree. Well, just being able to manage life, to be able to manage your life and get through that, that's a signal to employers as well. Okay, so even if it didn't add anything to your human capital, right, your intellectual or your ability to increase production, it'll be viewed as a signal of right, that you simply can get through the college degree, and that you must have some minimum level of threshold to do that, right? So getting a college degree, kind of completing the process, you signal that you at least have that dedication more than someone who didn't, right? Who started and then stopped. So, it doesn't matter if it increases actual performance, could just be a signal. So there was this interesting paper, and we won't kind of pull it up and dive into it today. I'll have a couple more like this, I think, on Thursday. But they found that being an athlete or being a student athlete raises the probability that a student ends up in a higher paying STEM job, right? So if I'm looking at the Miller College of Business and I'm comparing my regular kind of student body to my student athletes, the student athletes on average kind of have a higher expected starting salary in a STEM job. So this is like eliminating any professional, anyone who goes to the professional level, people who actually go out and kind of get a job in the field of their major, that the student athlete actually ends up with a higher paying starting salary. But if we look at a lot, anything outside of STEM, we actually see that they're kind of lower paying, right? They actually get paid less. And so the idea here is that there might be some selection, right? Your student athletes are choosing their major, right? So maybe the ones that are choosing a STEM major were kind of like the highest academic quality student athletes, and that your lower academic quality student athletes are going to potentially choose maybe some of the outside of STEM. Now, this is a very broad generalization. We're talking about averages here, but that was kind of the finding of this paper. Right? So why would some athletes make less and some make more, even if we look back, across majors or within majors? Well, we just look at the numbers. This is kind of interesting. Gives us a little bit of a snapshot. So kind of our business, we're some engineering, right? We've got a lot of business majors, but really other than that, you've got some engineering, and a lot of the other STEMs really aren't up there. The majority of the other kind of categories where we see a lot of student athletes going into, we've got communication, kinesiology. I'll tell you right now, my brother's a professor of exercise science, and they're if you get an undergraduate degree in kinesiology, it's very difficult to kind of get an initial high starting salary, right? So this is going to be one where we see all these student athletes have a relatively lower, on average, kind of starting salary. Sport and recreation management, we've got quite a few. That's going to be a fairly low paying kind of starting salary coming out. General studies, I haven't ever looked at the broad data, but I can almost go out on a limb here and guess that to see this many, if we're looking at kind of this survey of student athletes, that 230 of them were general studies. General studies degree doesn't do people a lot of good once you go out and kind of are on the job market, right? And so with these student athletes who are choosing these certain majors, we're already going to expect them to have lower starting salaries on average, right? Because they're kind of choosing majors that we know are paid less on average. I think this was kind of I think this was the most interesting kind of thing that when I was looking at this data that came out of it, was that really your kind of business and business related majors, there was just such a kind of high proportion of student athletes concentrated in that field. But yeah, this was based off of a survey of student athletes, kind of a random survey. Okay. Any questions on this or thoughts or comments? Like I said, I don't, you can't get the data for like every student athlete because that's like, there's HIPAA violations and I can't get that from every single university. But here, this was a random survey, so they kind of got a good idea of what majors they're choosing and in what areas. So some other benefits we can think to the athletes, and this is where we'll do a little bit with expected values and kind of think about how this would play out. So if I look across these different sports, right, another potential benefit is if I am of high enough quality to get to the professional level, well, that's a value of becoming a college athlete as well. If it allows me to get to the point where I can make money at the professional level, well, maybe that's why, I want to go to a certain school. So if I look across the different sports, right, the number of players drafted, and baseball is a little bit of an outlier here because they've got like this huge minor league system. So simply getting drafted, I forget how many rounds. I did a data set for someone here with some MLB draft data, and like there's just a ton of rounds, and they just draft 50. Yeah, there's 50 rounds. Like, yeah, they draft a lot, but a lot of them don't make it to the professional level. So we kind of look at the percent that make it to the professional level. And here, this one for baseball, this actually included any Division A, 1A, 2A, AAA, right? So there's a lot of drafted who don't even end up playing at that level. So the percent that go pro here is a little bit skewed for baseball because this includes all of the minor leagues as well. Right? So it probably, I forget the exact number. It's not as low as men's basketball. I think it's a little bit higher than men's football if we look at the percent that actually make it to the Major League Baseball, right, as opposed to kind of their minor league system. And you kind of look here, the rest of these, float around 1%. Men's hockey is a little bit higher, but that's only because there's just fewer men's hockey programs. So you've already kind of got this, the supply dwindled down a little bit. So pretty low percent chance that if you play at the NCAA level, you're going to make it to the professional level. Right? Now, another interesting thing to think about that's become more popular in recent years. So we look at women's and men's basketball. Notice like this column here refers to going professional like at NBA or WNBA level. This column over here was kind of added for these sports where there's also additional leagues. So for men's basketball, there's European leagues, right? There's a league, I think it's a Chinese league, right? There's a bunch of different leagues that have professional, or people call them semi-professional, but it's only because they're not the biggest league, right? European basketball, it's still a professional league, right? They're paid wages, they're treated like employees, and so because there are a lot more opportunities, we have a much higher percentage there, right? We have a lot more men's basketball players kind of going to the professional level, and if I remember right, they kind of they were limiting this just to D1 programs. This wasn't like D2 or D3. And some more of those opportunities exist in women's basketball as well outside of the United States. So you could start to do this thing where, okay, I know the likelihood, if I am a student athlete in a specific sport, I can figure out the likelihood that I'll go professional or make it to the professional level. I could then look at what's the average salary or average kind of career earnings in those different professional leagues. So I just chose kind of the main four here. And I took the average length of a career, which if we look at this, baseball and hockey have a little bit longer kind of average career lengths. And I looked at the average salary, right? So then the way I did average career earnings, I took the average number of years of a football player in the NFL, multiplied by how much they would on average make each year, to then get their kind of average expected earnings of every NFL player, and then similarly for the rest of these leagues. So we're looking here, we see the highest is Major League Baseball. And that's because if we just look at kind of the average number of years, they have the highest expected career. They also have the second highest kind of salary or expected kind of average salary. Okay? The NFL, while the average salary, we're thinking this goes across all players. So you could break this down differently if you already know that you're kind of one of the top-rated quarterbacks versus a top-rated punter or something like that. But this is just looking at averages. It's kind of an interesting way to think about this. So we have our average earnings. What we could then do is think about this kind of unique scenario where if I was a dual sport athlete, I think this just gets at the economic principle of expected value, but also the differences that exist across these leagues. So maybe we have a dual sport athlete that they're just a very talented person at everything they do, and they have their choice of which sport to play at the collegiate level and try to go professional in. Right? So if I was choosing on a high school the sport to go into, right, I'm going to have some personal preferences, but let's just focus on income. Right? So if we think we have an individual who just cares about the highest amount of income they can make, what we're going to end up with, so we have equal preferences across the sport, is we're just going to be comparing the expected salary. So we can find the average kind of career earnings, right? Or think about this average salary of someone who's making it into that professional league, and then multiply that by just the probability they make it to the pros. So that's what we call the expected value or the expected income that would come from choosing that sport, right? So if I, going from high school to college and I can choose the highest, or I can choose whatever sport I want, well, I probably look at this and say, and let's say I had the correct number for baseball. So let's say this was like, I think it's like, somewhere right below 2%. We'll use NFL as an example since that number's kind of a little bit skewed. So if I choose the, NFL, the percent chance that I'll go pro is 1.5%, right? Or the probability of 0.015. If I make it in the NFL, though, my average career earnings will be 7.38 million. So my expected value, right, for the future, well, there was a 1.5% chance, or probably of 0.015, I made it to the NFL, times whatever the expected earnings would be once I'm there. So kind of the expected value of choosing the NFL for this athlete would be pretty low. And that's really because the probability of making it professional is so low. It's kind of like the idea of a lottery, right? Your expected value of playing the lottery is negative, right? Because the probability that you lose is so high and the probability you win is so low that expected value is always negative. Same kind of idea here. It's not that it's going to be negative, it's just that it pushes it close to zero, right? Because we don't have kind of that cost of the lottery ticket kind of factoring in here. If we look at the highest, so you can do this for all the leagues if you want to. You could go back and kind of do a similar thing using these sports and their kind of probabilities of making it professional from the NCAA level. I just chose the lowest and the highest. So the lowest is actually the NFL, and then kind of your highest would actually be Major League Baseball. So it looks like, it's quite a bit higher than I thought. So the percent chance you play in a Major League Baseball game, it wasn't that 9% because that included kind of minor leagues. It's actually about 4.5%. Okay. Any questions on kind of this expected value idea? I think I have one more thing that I want to go through, and then we'll kind of, so I use the probability to make it to the Major League Baseball, not the minor leagues. So one thing I'll kind of want to end this topic on, and we'll kind of end class for today, is we could actually take this out and really complicate this, right? So I not only have kind of the percent chance that I make it from NCAA to college, the NCAA level to the professional level, I can also look at what percent of high school athletes in these different sports make it to college. So I could take this back to not just, what sport should a college athlete choose if they could choose any sport? What sport, if you were really trying to have the highest expected earnings, should you choose way back at, high school level? Well, we have varied percentages across all these sports for making it to any NCAA program. Then they kind of broke it down, Division I, Division II, Division III. Probably thinking Division I is the best thing to think about if you're going to go professional. So here's our kind of percent chance of making it from high school to the NCAA Division I program in baseball. I would then multiply that by the percent chance that once I'm at college, what's the percent chance that I go pro? And then I would multiply it by the average lifetime earnings. Right? And that's the expected value, okay? Because I first have to make it past high school, right? And the probability of that is also relatively low here, right? Especially for these D1 programs, okay? So if we're thinking about a young kid making this sporting decision, we would really take the probability of the NCAA, multiply that by the probability of making it from NCAA to the pros, and that's the probability we would use to kind of build our expected values. So if we think about which sport probably has the highest, well, if we go back here, we already know Major League Baseball was the highest before. And if we're comparing these here, what the highest men's golf, men's hockey, baseball, football. So, looks like men's baseball is a little bit lower here, but probably not enough for it to fall out of that first spot. Although that percent chance of making it to the collegiate level for hockey, men's hockey specifically, and women's hockey is quite a bit higher than the rest of them, almost twice as large. So you might actually, if we go through and do these computations, end up seeing that men's hockey rises up quite a bit in terms of the expected amount of earnings you can make, starting out in high school in any one of these sports. I don't think I have I did do it. Okay, I did all the computation here for us. Average starting salary of each, not average starting salary, the average kind of lifetime career earnings in each of these sports, the probability they make it from high school to the NCAA, the probability they make it from the NCAA to the pros, which then if I just multiply these two by each other, I'll get the probability that a high school athlete eventually makes it to the pros. Once I have that, I would just take that probability, multiply it by the expected career earnings, and I can end up with the expected value of, expected salary amount from choosing any one of these sports at the high school level. And you can kind of notice they're all really, really, $7,000, $8,000, $94,000, relatively low, right? So this is just the idea that, there's a lot of money to be made in these sports, but even at, we look at going from the high school level to the professionals, those probabilities are very low, right? If I play high school baseball, high school football, the probability I make it to the NFL is 0.1%, right? So really, really low probability I make it there. So the expected value, the expected amount of money I'll make is also going to be relatively low. Right? If we're just building expectations or kind of trying to if we're trying to kind of compute the expected value, right? Incorporating these probabilities. Any questions on anything here? I thought it was kind of a fun little exercise, kind of thinking about kind of how low these probabilities actually are. And then I think we'll talk about a few more things related to college sports, college athletes. Next class, I think that should take us into a couple papers that I want to look at. I'll probably bring in an Excel file on Thursday and come play around with some data. I've been meeting with a couple students here the last week or two about how to use their data for projects and kind of how to help them with some things in Excel. So hopefully just me working through more stuff in Excel will be helpful to everybody as you're kind of thinking about those projects, starting to kind of wind those down and get those ready to be submitted. Okay. Any other questions for me? Okay. We should have worked through everything that you need to do every question on the homework now. That's not due for a little bit. Like I said, it's on the 21st, but I would encourage you to start working on that early because you also should be kind of working on that project as well right now. So try to get that out of the way. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I can kind of help you if you get stuck in any of them. Other than that, go enjoy this nice weather, and I will see you guys again on Thursday.